Well, today is the wrap up of our series of webinars in October about the economy and innovation. But this one, as the concluding session, will be a discussion of not only where have we come from, but where are we going. I'll be moderating as the webinar proceeds, and I will ask all of you to keep your mute off unless you're contributing. And secondly, don't hesitate to use the chat function in order to discuss with others or to bring questions to the surface, as there'll be ample opportunity for commentary and insights. The guests today will be Trevor, and I'll show you them and we'll provide a bit of an introduction. Trevor Lewington from Economic Developers Alberta, Deanne Menard from Rural Development Network, Brad Ferguson, the ESG Secretary with the Government of Alberta, and Christopher McCabe, who is jointly involved at not only Institute of Health Economics, but at the University of Alberta. The webinar commences today, the 4th, and will last through till about 5:30. Up until this point, throughout the month, we've had 3 former webinars. The first one on monitoring the economy and economic recovery featured an interview with Robert Roach of ATB. And that was followed by a discussion on economic diversification with the lead presentation from Justin Reimer as ADM with what was at that time called Western Diversification, about purpose, progress, and prospects. And other contributors were Peter Josti, Alistair Koenig, and Eric Newell. And then last week, Greg McGilvery facilitated an excellent session on exploring innovation and the innovation ecosystem, with contributors being Terry Rock, Ling Huang, Michael Robinson, and Brian Felesky. What we've discovered up to this point over the course of the last 3 weeks has to naturally be put into sort of a macro format, in that we've only got so many words we can put on a sheet of paper and only so much we can really share. And so I've cited this under Creating the New Alberta. These are the broad initiatives that we've arrived at, but this is the current reality. And so as an introduction to this section, I'm going to read through this for those that haven't read the newsletter or weren't participating in the webinars to this point. And these are highlights of what we've learned about the economy and innovation, which I refer to as the current reality in the broadest sense. First is our vulnerability to shocks, then is the necessity of leadership for change, and finally, the role of government as a contributor to economic diversification. From the perspective of our vulnerability to shocks, we've learned that the economy, while diversified, is not resilient. And though progress is evident, the economy, referred to as what goes on in corporate investing, what happens in employment and jobs, and what's going on in terms of migration, we remain vulnerable and slow to recover, specifically to shocks in the price of oil for energy, and more recently, shortages of labor, such as we're witnessing during this pandemic. In other words, both energy and labor are probably among the most important elements throughout the economy. No region, urban or rural, no sector, industry, profession, or public service can claim to be resilient. We're all vulnerable. As for leadership for change, to achieve resilience, and that is to avoid a shock or to recover quickly from it, means change. And the change is not particularly popular. And that most institutions, professions, and in fact, individuals are often reluctant to learn unless shocked to do so. And so in the absence of a shock, or even to get out of it, requires vision and sustained leadership to, one, unite for overcoming fragmentation, for clarity, to ensure understanding, and agility, that is adapting to the ever-increasing rate of change, because change itself is a phenomenon that is for many shocking, who want the status quo and no change. As for government's role, to increase resilience, there must be an alignment of priorities. And the priorities that were cited were, one, the formulation of public policies as high priority for supporting entrepreneurship and small business innovation, and the global energy transition that isn't unique to Alberta, but is a worldwide phenomenon. And secondly, negotiating trade agreements, and that is increasing access for Alberta's goods and services. And thirdly, preparing talent. It came up over and over again. Research offering long-term job creation and the funding of education and training programs that are fitting for the future of work. So that's our background up to this point. We now have a panel, as I mentioned, Trevor Lewington, Deanne Bernard, and Chris McCabe are those who I'll call on initially. And and Brad Ferguson, wherever there you are. I'm looking at my own screen. So for starters, when we look at the current reality and what I highlighted as where we're coming from, Chris, Trevor, Deanne, Brad, either one of you want to raise your hands, or I'll call on you individually in terms of your perspective on where we are today, and from here where we might be going. Trevor, you were formerly a mayor, so you were right smack in the middle of where the public thinks we might be going, and whether or not that aligns well with what those being elected feel. You want to add your 2 cents worth as to where we have come from and where we might be going?
Sure, thanks, Perry. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. I think we have always been vulnerable to shocks. And so, there's been any number of trade disputes, whether it's softwood lumber or challenges with canola or government policy. And so, I think about all the different sectors in Alberta's economy. There have always been, and there will always be, different supply chain shocks or policy shocks or governance issues. But I think what the pandemic has taught us is that we're extremely vulnerable, particularly around supply chains and our dependence. We've lost some of our ability to sustain ourselves. And so that's really, I think, some of the key things moving forward. I mean, I'm glad Brad's here to talk about this growing sense around environment and social causes and corporate governance and the intersection of where government policy, corporate policy, and public interest meet. And certainly, this bubble population of millennials, it's sometimes referred to as cause marketing, right? This is the largest growing demographic who are all reaching the prime of their careers and their peak spending capacity, who are choosing to put their money where their mouth is and actually fund purchases and fund organizations that meet their social goals. So to me, it's less about, this is a sudden change. We've always had shocks, but it's our ability to be more resilient in the face of increasing shocks, more dramatic shocks, and more widespread. And I'll leave it there and let someone else comment.
That's an excellent point, and we'll come back to that, is the relevance of socio-demographics as reflected in the unique perspectives that millennials have versus maybe former generations. And we heard some of that, but we might want to dig into that somewhat deeper today. Chris, you want to bring us any perspective you might want to share on what we laid out in terms of where we are today?
Yeah, I'll try. I'm not sure how I'll be useful, but I like what your overview there. Strikes me that it's we've forgotten portfolio theory in public policy, in social policy. There's a reason why we are so lacking in resilience and over-dependent on a few industries, because through our tax breaks and our direct investment, actually for the last 2, arguably 3 decades, we have kept investing in the current winners, and not in the possible future winners. We haven't applied the same approach that we apply to our own share portfolios, of having a nice mixture of low risk, low return, but also a few high risk, high return. We have overwhelmingly in public policy, provincially and federally, and in common with most Western OECD countries, we have put a large proportion of our investment actually in the low risk, low return in lots of ways, established industries that are corporatized and don't really need the public money. They can raise their own money, but if we're going to give it them for a lot less, then why would they not accept it? And so at a fundamental level, resilience comes from portfolio theory being used by the public sector, by governments on our behalf. And I think we are reaping 3 decades of forgetting that basic fact, that actually the government should be the investor for the high risk and high return, and we'll leave the market to do the rest, to create futures. And we haven't done that. We haven't invested in the next generation of innovations, and that's why we don't have a lot of the green technologies that we'd like. That's why we have our labour force overly concentrated in the current large industries that are most subject to shocks. And so I guess what I would want us to encourage is that government should think about investing in the same way, the public funds, the taxpayer dollars, genuinely in the same way that good investors in the private sector and we as investing our own share portfolios think. We use portfolio theory. It is, inherent in that is more resilience, appropriate risk management, and better long-term rewards. And so, that's what I think we need to start doing. Looking forward.
We'll come back to this relationship of public sector to risk and the relevance of the private sector, and maybe also the tolerance of individuals to risk, given that there's $1 trillion to be passed on with my generation to the next generation, and whether or not that is an opportunity or a threat to the economy as a whole. Deanne, why don't you jump in here from your perspective, not just from a rural Canadian viewpoint, but from your own background in the economy.
Well, I will speak from the rural perspective as much as I can. And of course, in the past 100 years, we've seen that urbanization of our society going from mostly rural to mostly urban. And I really feel like that peaked about 10 years ago. And you can see that clearly in Alberta, where government took its offices that were spread amongst smaller communities and tended to centralize things in the bigger cities. You can see things like the rural secretariat federally being canceled. There really seemed to be an emphasis towards, well, we just need to focus on the urban centers, and that's where we're going to take care of things. Even, funding for things like homelessness. When they did their 10-year plan, they took all the funding from rural homelessness and they put it all in the cities. But I think over the past 10 years, the pendulum started to swing back. We realized, moving everybody to urban centers is not a great answer because, we were seeing a lack of services, meaning the people who are most vulnerable are getting shipped to the big cities, and that's not sustainable, and it's very expensive. And as well, because there weren't as many opportunities, we were seeing our best talent and our young people moving from those rural communities. So rural Canada, rural Alberta has really been suffering, but I see governments now saying, you know what, we need to invest more in those rural communities. It's not good for society to have these concentrated urban populations and then big spaces with nobody in them in between. So, but there's a lot of catch up that needs to be done in rural Canada. We need better transportation options. We need rural broadband to be ubiquitous and not just the patchwork it is now. We need to see more jobs and more educational opportunities in smaller communities. And the great silver lining of COVID is we've all realized that virtual life that we all thought was possible, but nobody was really willing to dive into. Well, we've all dived into it and it's working out pretty well. So we can have urban people working in rural communities and rural community people working in urban situations with that. And it's the same with education. So we have a lot of catch up to do in rural Canada, but I think we're starting to head in the right direction. But there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of opportunities as well.
Thank you, Dan. You brought a perspective that was shared several times or numerous times by Barry Mayer, who was with us for the first 3 sessions as a viewer. And
he's here today.
Well, he would echo, if he is here, I don't see him out there, but I'll echo what I think he's been advocating right from the very beginning, and that is he thinks we've been ignoring this schism between rural and urban Canada. And that if we don't pay more attention to the need to balance that, which takes you into things like the digital divide and the internet infrastructure, et cetera, not just to urbanize the rural area, but to bring the rural values back to urban. So I think you've touched on something early on that we hadn't cited in the Leadership for Change section. Brad, your turn. Giving you a chance to reflect on what you've heard to this point and bring your own perspectives forward.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation because some smart people in the room that I can learn from. You had 3 words. You had shocks and leadership and the role of government. And I look back on this kind of whole concept of shocks, and my question is, was it shocks, or was it a little bit of blindness? Meaning, did we not see the signposts coming? Like, demographics is the most predictable thing you could ever imagine, and it's the most predictable thing going forward. And you look at this, you go back in history, the social contract, which was really, I think, the last redefined during Roosevelt's years, and has really just perpetuated between government and business and citizen, and that social contract has kind of gotten bent out of shape. We had business getting too large, and the rate of technology adoption was greater than what public policy could keep up with. We had citizens being left behind, the 1% versus 90%. And really what we have is just this, deep desire to restructure that social contract right now. And, climate, is one of the tools of which to get that discussion on the table. There are other tools to get that discussion on the table, but it's really, creating a whole series of shocks. And I take the social contract, I think, really good comments about the urban rural, and the animosity, the inequities that exist today, the geopolitical environment, what we thought was, the rise of China and Asia, and now potentially the disaggregation of a global world. Those are big, massive trends that weren't necessarily unpredictable if we really think about it. Our Indigenous communities and the impact of those going forward in terms of the need for reconciliation and inclusion in the country, right down to then what happens is you have this massive size of government, and government involved in everything. And, these are trends that have been going on for almost 60 years. And we look at it now as the shocks that are coming about because of kind of a little bit of a rapidness and a lot of inequities. But really, a lot of these things were almost predictable. What the mistake was is we've had a leadership, your second word, which is leadership, which is really around, in my mind, very short view leadership. Long-term planning is 3 years sometimes right now. And as a result, we haven't had really good discussions about these trends that are now in front of us that seem like shocks, but really we should have been talking about these a long time ago.
This is very interesting, and you've elevated something that I think has been concern to all of us over the last 3 weeks. Is the discussion seems to be either on the social side or on the economic side, as if these two things can't be balanced. And the shock that maybe Alberta faced in an extraordinary way was between these two forces. NDP came forward with strong emphasis on social issues, and that riled up those that wanted to see the economics dealt with, and those on the economic side not paying as much attention to the social side, saying, well, we fund them. And how to find leadership that can bring a balance. I know last week, when Greg facilitated the session on innovation and the innovation ecosystem, the word that came up over and over and over again was collaboration, implying that we need to bring these disparate forces that seem to be running away from one another back to the table. And therein lies one of the, I guess, opportunities for the future is for leadership to be building bridges instead of this win-loss. And let's pick it up right from there. Chris, when you and I chatted, sometimes the discussion would be ideological, but I think we broke out of that and found there's a lot of pragmatism. Now, I don't know whether one looks to England or looks to Canada, looks to the United States, or, where do you look for anybody that's providing that leadership to address these rapid changes in socio-demographics, the speed with which technology is hitting us, right? The environmental scans, no matter where you look, say change and not getting any quieter. From your perspective, where do you step in? How do you advise leadership today?
I think you used the word collaboration, and I'd go further. I'd say it's recognizing interdependence. The argument that we are making choices between economy and health, or economy and equality, or economy and the environment, I think it's a false dichotomy every time, because they are interdependent, and what actually matters is what time scale you are measuring your costs and your benefits in different domains over. So if you measure the, just using the pandemic, because we're all, most familiar with it currently, as the exemplar, the argument that if you shut down, if we lock down at the beginning, that lots of small businesses would go out of business and the economy would crash, was credible if you took a 3 to 4 month time horizon. If you took an 8 to 9 month time horizon and said, okay, so we're not going to lock down and we're going to enable, companies, can stay open, but they're going to have to invest in all of this PPE and all of the protections, perspex screens, the air filtration. You're going to make all of these investments. But actually, because we haven't got rid of the virus, what we're doing is we're investing in another wave. We're not taking the pain in wave 1, but we are taking pain of wave 1 and wave 2. And so, and indeed in wave 3 and wave 4. And so what time horizon you choose to establish what the costs and the benefits are is really important. And it's really foreshortened in the pandemic example. There's no doubt that those economies that shut down hard early have paid a smaller economic price than those that tried to do what we did. And there's no doubt that those populations that lived in those places have had more days free from restrictions than we have. But it was the time horizon, and the same thing applies to environmentalism. And indeed, the same thing applies to inclusiveness. I often worry that the person with the brains to solve cancer actually was deprived of food too much in school in their early years, or just didn't get a chance, didn't come from the background where they could go to university. If you look over a 50 to 60 year time horizon, actually, we get a better, through diversity, we get a better portfolio and a better supply of talented people. And so, a big question is, what time horizon do we think is the right time horizon for just judging the costs and return on investment for these different policy choices that we've got to make?
Well, the management of time and policy is in itself an extraordinary challenge when you've got a 4-year cycle for those that have been elected, and some of the issues that need to be addressed are going to take longer. And they're already preparing for the next election. Trevor, you've been in that space. You're confronted with policies that might seem irrelevant to the population that's going to the voting booth. How do you handle a long-term perspective when in fact the public wants things immediate?
I think that is always the challenge that you need, back to your original, one of your original 3 words was leadership. You need people that are going to make the right policy decisions regardless of the political cost. And, and to build on Chris's point around interdependencies, the number one concern for existing business, they say, with what's holding them back in terms of growth is workforce. And for site selectors looking to invest in Alberta, it's also workforce. Okay, so what draws talent and what helps you retain talent? It's actually social policy considerations, this idea of place attachment, which means the place you live has to look pretty. There has to be social offerings where you can gather with friends and do things. You have to feel welcome, you have to feel included. So all of the social sort of traditional warm and fuzzy stuff that's really around this basis of place attachment, getting people interested and bought into their communities, is all of the things that actually underscore how you attract and retain talent, which is the main thrust of most business growth limitations in Alberta today. So the social policy very much is an economic policy, quite frankly.
That's fascinating. And I have to reflect on a consulting assignment I had some years ago in a community that name will go unmentioned in northern Alberta, where we had a process, a community process, an engagement process, an all-inclusive process to identify a brand, a new brand, a refreshing brand for that community. And what the committee came up with was the family-centered community, something about the relevance of family and a social factor in that community. And it was turned down, hands down. It had to be a brand that was about the economy, the richness of jobs, the immediacy of what might be offered. And yet today, that community is revisiting that brand, recognizing that for it to work, and for it to work with mothers, not just riggers, was to broaden the perspective of who is in our community, just like who is in our province and who is in our nation, and this diversity of cultures, this diversity of perspectives, and this diversity of experience. I mean, the young kids today, when we were surveying, were saying they're less interested in issues of privacy, trust, and government intervention, which the older generation seems to be watching like a hawk. Younger population seems to have a different perspective on who to trust and whether trust is as relevant as just getting what I want when I need it. Deanne, do you want to jump in here with anything that might have come to mind during this initial discussion on where we're coming from, where we might be going?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo Trevor, because, you know, when we see, especially in smaller communities, it's maybe a little more obvious where that interconnectedness of economic development, social development, and the environment, we call it the three-legged stool, and you need all three legs and you need to focus on all of them. You know, you can create jobs and stimulate business, but you're going to attract workers. Workers have families, they need to access services, whether they're businesses like groceries and shops and salons, or their services, social services like healthcare and education and daycare and things like that. And then everybody needs a healthy, safe, and affordable place to live. So we're seeing that huge issue in rural communities, just like in urban centers, where there's not enough affordable housing to support the workforce, right? So I was really happy to hear Trevor talk about that. And then you talk about leadership, Perry, and I think it's tough to look only to political leadership because of the short lifespan of a politician. And we're seeing in rural communities where we can look to what I call leadership in the unexpected places. So new roles for old institutions. You know, schools are often the lifeblood of a small community. We can see amazing leadership coming from schools. Same with churches. They can, you know, refresh their role. And I love to talk about a great example of a community in northeastern Alberta, Ontario, official population of 26. A new school principal came in. They were getting ready to close the school. He had the unenviable task of coming up with a reason to keep it open. Well, he's doubled the school population in the last few years to 64 in a population of 26 people. He has worked with local agriculture. They used to bring in temporary foreign workers for the season and then they'd leave. He's convinced the farmers to bring in these workers permanently, bring in their families. He's helping the wives or spouses of the farm workers to create their own jobs. He's creating a community hub where people can get together and have businesses and sell things and work together. He's created a school farm, which is becoming a center of excellence for people who want to send their kids there to learn about agriculture. And this is in a community in the special areas of Alberta with 26 people. So if they can do it there, it can be done anywhere, but it's about that leadership and allowing that leadership to thrive. So I really think if we invest in capacity building, especially in these smaller communities, it's a short-term investment that can lead to long-term success. So that's my little soapbox speech.
Ray, you wanna keep the momentum going?
Sure, I'll just go back and continually compliment Trevor. You'll find that as a trend all the way through this, by the way. But when I was at Edmonton Economic Development, I was CEO there for 5 or 6 years, from 2012 to 17, and we had to shift the Edmonton brand from an industrial brand to more of a progressive brand and a globally relevant brand. And the reason it was all around talent. Everyone under the age of 35 needed to be able to see themselves in a city that cared about things that they care about, and we talk about it. So let's escalate that up to the Alberta level right now, where we've got this incredible white canvas called Alberta, but we've got a black dot on it, and the black dot is energy sector, and whether we call it black or not, but it's a black dot. And we've been spending so much time, energy, and money trying to change the color of that one black dot. But what we haven't done is filled in the rest of the canvas with everything we have to offer, from everything that you talked about in previous sessions around diversification, but then you add on kind of this future-focused industrial economy ahead of us around CCUS, sequestration, hydrogen, solar, wind, geothermal, all those things that chemical engineers could be focused on now. And we realize that the next Jeff Bezos, the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates probably won't be all the 0 and 1 guys here or girls here, but it's maybe some chemical engineers that know how to bond C's and O's and H's together in different ways and coming up with the next billion-dollar idea. I mean, we haven't created a vision for anyone under the age of 35. And when we were in Edmonton, we realized that that was a huge limitation to our economic growth, like what Trevor was talking about, because, those kids if they couldn't see themselves here in a future of things that they cared about, they would try to find it somewhere else, and they left. And so I think we're playing in the same game provincially right now, and I think that's going to take all of us, everyone in this room.
Well, that's the bridging. I'm going to now transition into that other slide that I didn't touch on and see whether we've come close in terms of what we've talked about to this point, and whether or not we got it right, or whether or not we need to modify this in some way. So when you talk about the new Alberta or a different Alberta, or filling in the dots and creating something new or something different, we have here a list of broad objectives supplemented with some specific initiatives. Most of those initiatives I've left out at the risk of getting too granular. The first is investing in the future. And I think the point has been made about not being so short-term in our interests, and specifically about education, training, and mentorship, and a commitment of everyone to continuous learning across all sectors to capture opportunities in the digital economy and global energy transitions, and adapting to the extraordinary challenges of our time. There are a number of initiatives that we might refer to here. The second, and we've touched on this already, the cultivating of, we didn't use the word innovation, but innovation leaders, people with integrity, that is doing what they say they're going to do, that can build trust and develop integrated networks that engage public, private, non-profit players for advancing the case for innovation, identifying pioneers and challenge-minded managers. I'll add something here that I think often we get confused of the distinction between administrators that are maintaining policy and managers that are balancing inequities of supply and demand. And I think we've got a lot of administrators in our systems, but I'm not sure that we really have those experienced with or even embracing change, which is what managers are. Thirdly, increasing resilience, embracing emerging technologies, nurturing a culture of innovation, which came strongly out of what Justin contributed to in the second webinar of rather than an innovation ecosystem, he spoke about a culture of innovation, implying it was an array of values, not just money, marketing, management, manpower, mergers, marriages, or metrics, any one thing, but the array of all of that, almost like a soup, and embracing change, identifying big, meaningful problems, and one for starters and solving it. And then sustain prosperity, sharing the wealth, addressing public service needs, and investing in the social, economic, and environmental well-being of the province for its citizens today and into the future. Developing public-private personal relationships or partnerships, and setting strategic priorities rather than going it alone and wanting to take credit, becoming win-lose. And then finally, the emphasis on collaboration, initiating the building of all-inclusive pan-Alberta networks of interest for taking action in economic diversification and innovation, and for celebrating progress, ensure an all-inclusive representation of interest. Now, what I see in there is a little bit of what economic developers say they're doing. Now, whether they're integrated, whether they have a common vision, or whether they're all driven by their local municipal interests, I can't comment on that. But I mean, Trevor, you must have a perspective there on whether or not economic developers that are paid to make a difference in the long haul are administrators, managers, where they have adequate authority in order to meet the challenges. What role are economic developers playing in meeting some of these challenges and taking these directions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a broad range, of course. Our membership across the province is about 350 people, frontline economic developers doing the work in communities across the province. Many of the challenges they face, of course, is in smaller communities, they're a one-person operation, or it's off the side of their desk, and they're also the communications person and the director of emergency management or some other thing. So the challenge for a lot of economic developers is focus and sort of the resourcing, or it's not seen as a priority. So, you know, in the last year or so, we've actually lost membership, and that's a result of communities actually eliminating economic development positions. So it's counterintuitively one of the first places that smaller communities tend to cut. So that's an issue. But you know, what we have seen is increasing networks. And I'll use myself as an example. So I'm an economic developer by day, CEO for economic development in Lethbridge, an elected politician in the evenings and weekends, you know, being the mayor of Sterling, which is about 20 minutes on the outside. But we've got a number of regional initiatives. So we've got Canada's premier food corridor. We're marketing a section of Highway 3 between Lethbridge and Tabor as a global food hub. We've got a trade and logistics corridor along Highway 4, which is multiple private and public sector partners working together. You know, we've seen collaborations like Edmonton Global, quite frankly. So out of the ashes of the long history of growth management boards and some of the struggles in the capital region, we've seen this coalescing together of a united brand, but also shared resources and this concept that, you know, rising tides do lift all boats. And so the idea that Edmonton is using is they go to market as a brand, they bring investors to Edmonton, and then each community puts their best foot forward. But it's that initial going to market as a unified front that I think is important. So Team Alberta has an opportunity there. You know, we joke a little bit about the Battle of Alberta and the Edmonton versus Calgary, and you know, some of that is still very much alive. But even smaller communities around me in Lethbridge and some of our neighbors, I see Bill Chapman's on today, and he's in the town of Coaldale. Far too often we're competing against each other when from an international perspective, Alberta itself is too small, right? So we have to get past ourselves. We have to get out of our own way, because large multinational companies, when they're looking to invest, they're not looking at the boundary on the map. They frankly don't care. So everything from permitting to licensing to infrastructure, it's really, they don't want to be bothered with the idiosyncrasies of each community battling over jurisdiction and who's responsible. It should be as simple as possible. And I think Alberta collectively still has a long way to go as a cohesive sort of unified front. And for me, that starts with a compelling vision that we all buy into and then working towards that. So we see pockets of success. There are alliances, there are regional alliances, there are regional initiatives, but we need to accelerate that work and we need to strengthen that work in my mind.
Let me challenge you for a second. Economics and putting our foot on the accelerator says we just need to do better what we have been doing. We need to do more of, we need to network. But are we ignoring what we were talking about earlier of economic development office being conscious of the social environment within which those economies are going to flourish? Are they viewed as being too narrow in their perspective and only thinking about immediate job and wealth creation as opposed to creating an environment that is receptive?
Again, I think it very much depends on the municipality and it depends on the structure of the economic development organization.
That's leadership. That's leadership.
And that's leadership, right? So again, I can only speak to my own personal experience. We have a separate program for women in STEM. So it's federally funded through what was Western Diversification, but it's specifically targeting women, female entrepreneurs, and helping them accelerate their work. And out of that, we've developed technology incubators for both Indigenous entrepreneurs and newcomer Canadians. So, you know, there are specific programs, there are different pieces of work in that social space that we can do as economic developers. And some of us have license to do that and are quite happy to, and other municipalities or other organizations can be more restrictive. And so that's the work, is educating those in power or those with policy control to help them understand those interdependencies and help ensure that they see the big picture and they're supporting the right investments to do the right work.
Well, when we talk about cultivating innovation leaders, I think what we're really getting at is looking at leadership tomorrow or today immediately that understands the dynamics between the social and the economic. And it's not one or the other, but how do you balance both at the same time? When I was first exposed to what ESG was all about, the word that went along with it was activism, advocacy, and I had to write it down because I often forget it, that existential crisis, that nothing is more important than ESG, in which case we're prepared to sacrifice our economy in order to achieve our objectives of climate change, social justice, and ridding ourselves of capitalism and corporate governance. Brad, I'm going to jump the queue here and throw you right smack in the middle of this. If ESG is being driven by, we got an existential crisis here, the world is coming to an end. If we don't buy into this stuff, we won't even have an economy. How do you survive in an environment like that? I mean, what's your role, or what is your perspective on where ESG needs to fit? Maybe that was just the introduction of what ESG is to get attention, but is it crisis? Is it creating crisis that ESG needs in order to make a headway?
Well, I don't think so. I think what ESG, like anything, can be weaponized for any particular need. But ESG was traditionally a lens, and still is a lens, in which corporations are evaluated for non-financial performance and basically impacts, sustainability impacts. And what we're seeing, and why an ESG secretariat was created within the government of Alberta, is we realized that that lens is very similar to a lens in which people are starting to evaluate a jurisdiction and make reputational conclusions about a jurisdiction. And so whether that's an investor, a visitor, it could be a student, it could be a researcher, it could be whoever looking to do any type of business in Alberta or in a local jurisdiction, it's a lens which is now just commonly looked through as to how people are making decisions. So if we don't pick it up, and I think we can look at it as a negative and say, if we don't pick it up as a province and communicate around it, we could be overlooked, and we could be the subject of negative screens that are happening, and they've happened in the energy sector, and they're starting to actually spill over into other sectors. But if we look at it as a positive, it actually allows us to look across our different ministries and the province as a whole and tie together the really interesting and great work that's being done into a common narrative, and actually express that narrative internationally or nationally. And it really allows us to shift from an Alberta, which has been always a fight everything kind of Alberta, to an Alberta that's here for good, and here's how we're using and unleashing and unlocking our human and natural resources to their fullest potential to do some really positive things in the world. And if we make that shift in the narrative, then we can use ESG as a positive. Otherwise, it's always going to be a lens in which we're reactive to.
So from a communications perspective, if we've been viewed as that black spot, and we wish to be seen as more vibrant, more all-inclusive, more conscious of things other than energy, we've got a ways to go. We've got a branding issue, if you will.
Yeah, I think so. It goes right back to what we've all talked about, whether it's a small rural town or a major city, is we have to tell different stories. And let's look at the social side and tell our stories around, women in leadership positions, our Indigenous communities, new immigrants, our elderly, people with disabilities. Like, these are all social and societal things that people care about. And if we can't express that as a jurisdiction, then, we're telling a very narrow story, which is where you're going to get your job maybe, but, how are we going to live, and how's this community going to come together to solve complex problems? That's a different series of anecdotes we need to pull from. And to do proper storytelling, we need to build that house of anecdotes ready to go. And that's going to require a lot of people to be willing to tell their stories, not just the policymakers, but industry, and a lot of our nonprofits as well. And that's where we should be drawing stories from.
Well, and we certainly need to bring our youth into that equation, because they are the inheritors of either boots and mud and quarter-ton trucks, or more socially minded. Deanne, if this is a branding issue, and you pointed out earlier, we've got to recognize rural Alberta is not dying, or rural Canada is not dying. Rural Alberta, or the rural part of our society, is critical. we've got some branding to do there to be seen as inclusive and to be seen as more than just drifting into a totally urban environment. Do you want to add anything about how you go about branding the rural area is in fact very relevant to the future?
Well, I think if you look at smaller communities, rural communities under the ESG lens, we've already got some advantages, especially urban people tend to look at, rural as a very bucolic, idealistic kind of way. And there was a great study out of Memorial where they took pictures of rural Newfoundland, and they showed them to people who are local, further away in Canada, further away in the world. And the further away they got from rural Newfoundland, the more valuable people found those pictures. So I think we don't tend to value what we have in our rural communities. We think they're not important. I have another great story about a farmer bringing some people over from Japan and driving out to Galahad, and the Japanese people are like, stop the car. And they had to get out, and they just wanted to stare at the countryside for 30 minutes because they've never seen so much land that's just open, right? So we need to learn to value what we have and look at it from that other perspective. And really, going back to that collaboration piece, we really need to figure out ways to stop that co-opetition. Trevor talked about we're all in competition with each other, whether it's government or other mechanisms. We need to discourage that co-opetition. We need to incentivize people working together, because time and again, even when I see groups of communities working together as a region, I still see them in the background working on their own little thing. I don't know if it's like hedging their bets or what, but they just can't get into the whole. This is about the region. They still have to do their little things in the background. So how do we get away from that? Because, if the province isn't big enough in the world stage, well, our little provincial regions are not even gonna register as a spec, right? So we need to work together regionally and then increase it across the whole province. And we have lots to offer, but we have to figure out how to package that.
So we've emphasized to some extent, to a great extent, the importance of collaboration, of networking, of recognizing our neighbors, of the values that we share. There's a force that can't be ignored, and that is the force of innovation. We haven't talked very much about innovation other than innovative thinking, but technology is coming at us left, right, and center. Very urban in its orientation, very much about the individual with the amount of data that's being shared. We talk about a culture of innovation, of embracing change, not just valuing our past or valuing our history, or evaluating one another, but valuing change and valuing technology, which seems to be drifting into an urban me perspective. Chris, you want to add anything in here? I mean, this is something you and I have talked about from time to time. You want to elaborate on that and tell me I'm full of baloney, which you're
I don't think you are. It's what's a real challenge, and I guess what we try to do with our SME life sciences platform is the separating out the innovation from the invention. There's so many good ideas, there's so much new knowledge being generated, but lots of it isn't a solution to a problem that we value right now. And helping the innovators to understand early on whether that really is, whether they've got a solution to a problem that's a priority, that's high value, it is something we need to figure out how to do. We kind of increasingly have a model for it in healthcare because we have a relatively few number of customers. It's not individual mostly in healthcare. It's health systems and it's governments and it's private insurance companies who are the customers, and we know pretty much what they want to buy. And so it's possible to say, yeah, this is, this actually has a good value proposition really quite early on. I think it's much harder outside of health, really, and I guess oil and gas, where you've got these few big customers who are really clear about what they're willing to pay for. In that broader sort of innovation space, social innovation, and across the piece, really, it gets really hard to figure out how to get early. You can't pick winners, but you can pick losers. And putting in place infrastructure to triage out the losers so that neither the innovators nor the investors, including public, put their money behind things that are not likely to be good value. If we're going to be purposeful in using innovation and harnessing innovation to have the problem, to help us solve our problems, then I think we need to think about helping pick the losers and get them out of the game early, and you know, help them to understand the link between the knowledge they may have generated in a university lab somewhere and high value social problems that people are willing to
but the principal value for an SME is to make money, to get cash flow going, to make money almost regardless, as if somehow that is the holy grail that once I got
right. And I think
regardless of its impact.
You've put your finger on something really important, which is the reward function. You know, and I think somebody else said earlier, you know, this, I think Yogi said earlier, this pressure to make money early can actually get in the way of longer term planning. And maybe we need to think about maybe, you know, the limited liability partnership, or, you know, the corporation incorporation is not always the best model for the early phase of an innovation development vehicle. Maybe not-for-profits where that pressure to make money, extra money, is not quite as intense, it is something that we should look at. It's not always, the market's really good with well-defined technologies, with well-defined value propositions. But some of our problems are so complex that actually getting to that sort of state of a well-defined problem with a well-defined solution, maybe, you know, that's not where we are for some of this stuff. Maybe we need different corporate vehicles. And when we're, as society, we're backing innovators, we might want to back them through different corporate vehicles that take some of those, you know, it's all about cash flow now, pressures off them. I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm just thinking.
One of those models, I mean, I think we're all looking for whether or not a new model is emerging that brings a better balance between my product and what I know versus my product relative to what the consumer needs or what my staff need, to get a better balance. And I know when we did research on why small businesses tend to fail in Alberta, it had nothing to do with engineering and product. It had a great deal to do with not knowing their customer, not having relational skills. But there is a model. The co-op is a model.
Maybe.
I mean, the co-op is an example of where there was some frustration, where in working together, you could have more impact that was healthy for their local communities. Co-ops found their being in rural areas where people needed to work together, where they didn't have what urban areas have, which is plenty of supply. They needed to get the collective together in order to survive. Brad, you want to jump in here? I've dominated a little bit too much, and I'm sure you can add more value.
I'm not the you know, smartest guy on innovation, that's for sure. But you know, we've spent an inordinate amount of money on, you know, the primary innovator, and I look a lot in Alberta as where what we're really good at is we're really fast adopters. We may not be the area or the location where a lot of primary innovation happens, but I'll tell you, when I look at existing industries, the innovation that happens in them is because they're very much risk takers and they adopt faster than a lot of other jurisdictions. So this, I think, you know, when it comes to innovation, is this mindset of you can innovate whether you're, you know, a scientist or a teacher or a doctor or a farmer or whatever. It's just having that constant innovation, that radical adaptation mindset. And if we can inculcate that into our youth, the way some mentors of mine on this screen, yourself, Barry Mayer, Alec McPherson, you know, these guys pushed that innovation piece all the way along in terms of always thinking and having that, you know, consistent adaptation mindset. if we do that to our youth, I think we're in good hands. But I'll take adoption over innovation a lot of times.
I think you've also touched on something that Justin posed, and it really added value to the discussion throughout. And that was in using the word culture. We're not made up of pieces. What we're ultimately made up of is the processes that bring those pieces together. We've been very focused in Alberta and in Canada on commodity, wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas. That's what our market wants, the US principally, and in fact, often get a sense that we start processing our raw materials. So in order for us to make headway, I think we need to become more process conscious, and that's what management is. And that's what our graduates need to be more appreciative of, I think, is the relevance of values in those technologies. They're values that Deanne and Trevor have articulated in their more, quote, isolated communities. And what Brad, you've brought to the surface of that ESG is really a vehicle for making sure that we are conscious of the values of what we do in our economy, not the economy alone. It's about 5 o'clock. We've got about a half hour to go. I'm going to open up discussion and give the floor to the first person that raises their hand. And if you don't raise your hand, I'll call on you. Yogi, what are you thinking about right now? You've always had something to share.
Well, I'm thinking about all of the great organizations that have been represented in this event and the previous ones. And I would assume that they're not all sitting on their hands. And maybe we shouldn't worry about it that much. Maybe we've got enough resilience, and adding more resilience is going to add more cost and value. Now, I don't know if that's a contrarian viewpoint that's going to get me kicked out of this meeting.
No, you're not kicked out, so keep going.
Okay, so I wonder if we're maybe beating ourselves up. Sure, we can make some minor changes here and there, but I bet that there are many countries on the planet that would be in awe of the number of organizations and groups and funding that we have in our super well-developed first world country. And maybe it's as good as it can get.
A senior government official a few years ago and I had a chat, and he wanted to know, I guess I gave it away, he wanted to know what might be done in order to advance diversification, prosperity, innovation. And I said, to some extent, you've got to be patient. It's not the lack of money, maybe even the lack of talent. Alberta needs experience. We need the experience of failing and winning, the experience of getting through cycles, the experience that's associated with building relationships. We are a relatively young province. And it's not surprising that these relationships are still yet to be formed, and that we haven't had enough experiences, particularly among our youth and maybe the seniors who had it, I'd say, relatively easy. That would say you might be onto something, Yogi. We need to be patient. We need to be tolerant. We need to continue to emphasize the relevance of the values which we take forward, the importance of appreciating our neighbors.
So I'm impressed by the talent you've invited to come to these events. And when I think of the names of the organizations and kind of scroll through their website of what they do and why they exist and what they're trying to help with, I'm impressed.
Okay, where should we send money? Do you have a phone number? Cam, you smiled there. You're obviously listening. Cam, you want to share any, what comes to mind as you've been sitting there taking notes? Cam Anderson.
Yeah, thanks. You kind of surprised me there, Perry. I think Yogi's got a pretty good point. In my experience, I've had a few travels abroad, and well, Brazil, for example, is a country of extremities, the extremely rich and the extremely poor. And yet the more well-off complain terribly about their tax rate, which is about half of ours. So it's not so bad. I think we should be thinking more long-term, and I liked Chris's comment about the 50, 60-year plan. I like to think in terms of centuries, and I think that's where maybe China has really shown us some of their capability in turning around from absolute destitute poverty and unleashing the power of capitalism within their context, but making it happen. And so I think any efforts by governments, et cetera, that would support those far-reaching objectives, the ones that are, for example, the idea of geothermal energy using oil patch technology to drill down into the deep layer of the crust. There's a huge number of opportunities that Alberta has that they could really get behind the research, and I think that's the part that maybe I'm reflecting what people were already saying, but I hope so. That if we strongly support those initiatives that are a little bit out there, a little more risky, spin-offs will start to become the ones that become the profit-making companies.
Thank you. Greg, you want to jump in here, and then I'll call on Barry.
I'm going to jump in and take Yogi to task with all due respect. Even if things are pretty good, there's always room for them to be better. And I think what we've built up over the last 150 years are very complex adaptive systems. And we need a response to complexity. We need a new form of organization I would call a collaborative that is a highly integrated response to these complex systems that builds on the values of dialogue, collaboration, and storytelling. So just like we needed an evolution from sole proprietor to corporation 200 years ago when we industrialized, we brought a body of people to the proprietor to build and to industrialize. We need ways of bringing bodies of stakeholders together in response to the complexity that we've built. So I'll just pitch that over the fence for anyone around.
The building of relationships, the building of networks, the whole issue of having a unified or integrated society can be sped up a bit. To simply wait and be tolerant. And Deanne, you made the note online. I saw it. No matter how good we get, there's always room for improvement. And even if you're number one, you can't sit on your laurels. I think that's echoing Greg's point. And I don't think Yogi is saying no, but he's recognizing we're coming from a position of strength, that we haven't been, this is not the end of a civil war where you're trying to mend disparate pieces together. We've got incredible wealth and advantage in Alberta, and maybe we could do even better in the face of competition and a world of change. And I think that's the point Greg is making. Barry, you want to add more here?
Well, Greg said some of it, and I really come back to the difficulties that we have as Deanne has said, is this rural-urban split keeps getting wider, and in fact, the rest of the world looks to us, if they look at all, for resources. And the thing that worries me the most is that we're on a trajectory, if we keep going in the same direction we're going currently, into this turmoil that's international, that a change from globalization to I'm not sure what to call it.
Populism.
Yeah, that's true. And Brad had another word for it. But my concern is that we elevate our view of where we fit in the world relative to the rest of the world. And we have to get real, and there are some things we can do to make sure we have a cash flow that allows us to do the social things we want to do. And the educational things that need to get done has to be one of the elements on the ground. But my concern is that it's in our own heads right now that we think we are way beyond where the rest of the world thinks we are. And it may be that we're not communicating it right, but it also may be that we actually have an elevated view of the importance of what is really 0.001% of the population of the world, whether we look at Alberta alone or whether we look at Canada alone. And one of the things we have to worry about big time is that I don't know, do we have 10% of the world's habitable land? Do we have 15%? And we're that 0.001% of the population. And can we afford to do the things that people have convinced young Canadians that we can afford to do? How are we going to do that? And I think this whole discussion is around getting ourselves back to the reality of what is the world around us, including our own society, and what we can expect from it.
So therein lies, again, one of the challenges of leadership is to think global and act local. I didn't invent that term, by the way.
No, but yeah.
Is we do exist as individuals in the world at large, and it's never been more obvious than it is today with the internet, with the news that acquaints us with what's going on in the world at large every day. You don't wait 6 months, 6 days, or 6 hours to find out when there's a tsunami someplace or a riot or a coup. We are in the world every day, and our economy is in the world. We've got the longest pipelines in the world. We've got some of the most modernized logistics and distribution systems. We're vulnerable because of that if someone closes them down, but so are our customers. You mentioned, Greg, or someone did along the way, China. I'm going to caution, we don't need to have an extensive discussion at this session about China. We will be probably in November doing a session or sessions specifically on understanding China from an economic and social perspective, because there are changes underway. They also go through their cycles of ups and downs, but I think thanks to Ling and Barry and a number of others, we've decided that in November we'll put together a panel austere to talk about what is it we know or need to know more about if we're going to form relationships with others in the world, and more specifically on the Western front into China. Arden, you've been a client of Scenarios to Strategy. You've been someone understanding environmental scans. Your world has been about strategy. I know you well, even though you may not know me, from your writings and what you advocate for. Come on, share with us, as we get down to the last 15 minutes, your perspective. Arden, and you're muted.
I haven't been party to your earlier ones, so I was interested in, I'm asking myself, what triggered this whole discussion? Well, because the energy and the oil and gas industry is under threat, right?
Yeah, I'll step back. In 2015, we started, whoever we are, monitoring Alberta's economic diversification because it had been talked about for 20, 30 years. And yet, if we did a measure of it, could we say that we've made progress? So we met with the universities and we met with government to try and get an index that we could use as a monitor. And unfortunately, none of them had any, and said the data is so inconsistent. So instead of data, we went for sentiment. And the sentiment, interestingly enough, correlated with the price of oil. And that was to no one's surprise. So Alberta's economic resilience seems to be tied to whether or not oil is up or oil is down. But the other thing we monitored was the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem, which ran in parallel until the last 6 months, when it seems awareness of the relevance of innovation and our economy is growing. And people are well aware that we need to be much more conscious of what it takes in order to expedite innovation. So where this particular forum comes from is a thirst to understand better what it takes to make this province more resilient to the shocks of oil pricing, and what we can do to advance diversification through innovation.
Okay, well, I have a number of comments, but I'll just, one of the things that struck me, there's two things I want to say. One is the distinction between macro and micro. And
Yes.
I'm not talking about rural urban, I'm talking about micro and macro. And I see the macro as being the policy framework. That's the high level policies that help companies, individuals, organizations thrive. You can use whatever you want, okay? And there's ones that encourage economics, there's ones that encourage education, for example. We're all touching on that sort of thing. And then there's the micro, and the micro is what's happening at, say, company levels or organizational levels. And number of years ago, there was a study, it was called Profit from the Core. And the study said, if we look at a company that's made profits for 10 or 15 years regularly, what's happened to them? And most of the companies that have had consistent profitability are ones that stuck to their core business and kept improving it. And so it isn't about, I don't think the future here is about some silver bullet that we're going to suddenly discover hydrogen and the world's going to take off. It's about individual organizations, companies improving incrementally time and time. We might have an innovation, a great innovation. It'll be wonderful for Alberta, but I think innovations in companies, and the oil and gas companies are high-tech companies. They've been using that stuff tremendously. Agriculture has been moving higher and higher into high-tech activities. So these are organizations which are incrementally improving, innovating, solving problems. It's not big problems. They're solving little problems. And as they do that, that innovation leads to higher productivity. And that's the essence of where we get our standard of living. So I like to distinguish between the big policies that allow this kind of stuff to happen, and then encouraging, setting the framework to help individual companies keep improving their own activities. But I don't, leadership, okay, we always need leadership. We need people to frame problems. We need people to encourage that sort of stuff. But I think a lot of this improvement will come from incremental improvements. I mean, we're looking at oil and gas. After you looked at oil and gas, what's by far the largest industry in Alberta?
Government.
Healthcare.
Yeah. Public services.
There was a number of years ago that, for example, they looked at Houston and they said, what happened to Houston when they had the oil collapse? Well, they've diversified. Their biggest industry since then, or one of the big industries diversification, was healthcare. We look at healthcare as a cost, but heck, look at the people who make a living out of healthcare, and it's growing at what, 6% a year, 7% a year? This is a huge growth industry. Do we look at it that way? No, we look at it at a cost. So I just think that, maybe I'm with Yogi a little bit in terms of, I'm not so sure that we have a huge problem to solve. I think we just have to encourage the ongoing activity. I'll just add one final comment. In 1986, the oil price collapsed. For the first time ever, engineers were laid off. The engineers did what? They couldn't find a job, so they started creating their own activities. By 1990, the economy had diversified dramatically. Then the oil price went up. Guess what? If it's easy to make money out of oil, you're not going to do it in something else. So your comments earlier about it goes up and down with the oil price, I think is absolutely correct. But I'm just saying there's a bottom-up process to this thing that I think will be very compelling. Sorry to take so much time.
No. Two things. One is, some of you have heard me tell this story, that George McNamara, when he was an advisor to the President of the United States, said, with the military industrial complex, we have something that will not feed inflation. And what he will do is he will establish zones in the United States. North Carolina Triangle, Boston, and Silicon Valley were by example. And every now and then he would terminate the contracts. Now, why would he do that? Because it was an engine of innovation. When you threw 15,000 engineers into the streets, they didn't die and go to welfare. What they did is they became creative and started Hewlett-Packard's and a number of companies in Texas, et cetera. So what they did is they created artificial crises to stir innovation. Now, it took a shock to do that. The blessings we have is Calgary. Calgary's 100,000 engineers and whatever that were thrown into the street 2 or 3 years ago did not roll over and die or migrate out. They took some of their savings and they, in fact, have now contributed to what I am seeing. When I look at LinkedIn invitations that are coming out of Calgary to my network, they're all in IT. The transition that is underway, and it shows up in our survey, of how resilient Calgary actually has become from where it once was. The community that's having difficulty is Edmonton because of public sector resistance to innovation. So when you talk about healthcare, and this will come back to Chris, how do we expedite innovation? Now, Deborah James at the University of Alberta has recently launched an initiative to look at what the university might do differently so it doesn't impede innovation, but can expedite it without triggering a lot of snake oil. So there are things that we can and maybe need to do within the institutional structure that has benefited and become as large as it is in order to expedite innovation and create that culture that we thirst on. So I'm going to stop pontificating there about something that I feel passionate about and look for someone. Mel, you haven't spoken up yet, and you've always got something to say, particularly of galaxies. Yeah, go ahead. You're muted. Yeah, we can't hear you, Mel. Going once? Yeah, we got
Here
you.
we go. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, just going back on a couple of things. I first of all want to say I do agree with Arden on the viewpoint he's taken, and Yogi hit the nail right on the head there too. But with ingenuity, it is good. Good ideas are always good, but sometimes we have a problem in, I don't want to say prioritizing them because we can't look at them all, but a lot of people go along with and support those ideas or those phrases that are easy to understand, but may not be the ones that are really needed right now. So I sort of struggle with trying to figure out how we can actually put together something that can help us get to that longer term target. Looking out 40, 30 years is somewhat difficult. We've got a really dynamic environment. So it's, if you put yourself back 20 years ago, who could have predicted where we are now? Generally, yes, technology moves, electric cars, all that type of stuff. But trying to get all of that working, there's got to be one step, after another. There can be a lot of things done in parallel, but I think we need to have, I'm reluctant to use the word clearinghouse here, but something like that. It just can't be, let's try this, let's try that. I know I'm a little out of my league here. It's not my.
Well, I think you've made a very important point, and it needs to be reinforced. And that is, leadership is not necessarily about telling you what to do, but creating a culture which inspires the individual to realize that what they are doing is meaningful and important. And I reflect on leaders like Sir Winston Churchill and Mahatma Gandhi, Eisenhower, et cetera, even Pearson. That when you talk to individuals, they felt that leader was relevant to them as a person, and that inspired them to do what they thought was right for their communities because they felt relevant. I don't think we need leadership today to tell us where to go. I think what we need leadership to do is to reinforce our relevance as individuals on matters like ESG, Brad, and the relevance of those to our economy as well as to the building of our communities, Dan. So I think you've touched on something important, Mel, as we struggle to determine what's the message. Sometimes the message is not a specific message, but a message of clarity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I wish to hell they'd stop calling, whoever it is, probably my banker. Larry, come on, Larry. You're never shy with a perspective. Give us your 2 cents worth as we get close to wrap up.
You know what? The world's changing so quickly, right? When you look at it, you look at the rapid pace of change and that type of thing. How do we have people lose like a fixed mindset and develop a growth one? And part of what we found during the pandemic, from my point of view, is people can work remotely. So, we've talked about globalization, we've talked about ruralization, right? We've got people globally, we've got people rurally that are really smart people, right? If we can have them develop that growth mindset, and if we can all as organizations develop that mindset, then I think we can innovate and deal with the pace of change that we have to deal with. So it's interesting, some, maybe I'm being contrarian, but some of that paradigm of the community that we live in to attract people in a virtual world, do you need that sense of community?
Very important. Deanne and then Alex. Go ahead, Deanne.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up something that I don't think has really been touched on yet, and it's a real barrier that's already starting to impede diversification, resilience, innovation, all of that, is the emerging labor shortage. We're sitting in the middle of a perfect storm right now of seeing the lowest workforce participation rate since the 90s, a sudden increase in retirement, baby boomers who've decided I can retire now, I don't want to work in COVID, and the decrease in immigration. So that many fewer people coming into the world. I know we personally have a number of vacancies, and we're a not-for-profit in Edmonton. But everybody I talk to, it's a huge barrier, and now we're starting to, almost have to scrape the barrel to find anybody to do the work. It's going to be a lot harder to do that innovative and resilient type work if we can't solve this really quickly.
Deanne, at the risk of opening up a can of worms here, and I'll close it down if that starts to happen, you've touched on something that is very important, and whether or not there's a lesson to be learned here. Some say that things like guaranteed annual income will work because people inherently want to work. But is what's coming out of COVID an indication that if you give them enough money, they won't work? And it will move into a creative economy where people spend time coming up with creative and interesting things to do. Do you have a sense that people really do want to work and that we just can't find enough human beings to bring into the market? Or are there people out there that have just sort of bailed out and said there are better things to do than try and make a living? I'll live off my the dole.
Well, at the risk of sounding politically incorrect, if they are happy to live on very little, then they're probably not going to be those innovative, hardworking people that have, well-educated, smart people. So, I don't think though the people who don't want to work are the people who are going to make the difference. I think we need to really encourage young people. I think they have a really bad rap as being entitled and not willing to work hard. We take a lot of chances on young people, and 9 times out of 10, they turn out to be smart, innovative, enthusiastic, energetic, hard workers. So I'd like to see more support of those young people, but making sure that they are able to get meaningful work, because they're, I think, going to be the driver of making sure we're resilient and diversified and innovative.
Well, we do know that youth have identified as one of their highest priorities, or whether or not there will be work for them. The future of work seems to be in everyone's interest, from the Royal Bank to the universities. Is there work for the future, or is artificial intelligence, et cetera, taking over? But I'm not going to open that up any further. We'll leave that on the whiteboard to be revisited in future. I said, Alex, you'd be next, and then we'll wrap it up with Chris. So Chris, I'm going to give you the last few minutes, but I'll ask Alex to share with us his perspective as we get to wrap up now. Alex, you're probably muted if you're still there. Okay, he chatted, gave us a note. Right on, Yogi. We need to stop spending all of our time on debate between public and private healthcare and get on solving the problems. Social incentives drive social collaboration, but cultures of individualism tend to be antisocial. Alberta has a strong culture of individualism, much more me than we, but we're breaking out of that as the province matures. Chris, you have any? We've got a minute or two to go. You want to give us any wrap up, and then I'll ask each of the those who've joined us today, Trevor, Deanne, and Brad, to close it off. So you begin, Chris.
I feel like I'm something of an imposter, and I don't have anything like the depth of experience that many people on this call do. So I venture my observations cautiously, and thank you for your patience if I've said things that you know are just downright.
Your humility is appreciated.
I think I'm hopeful, actually. I do believe that people want to work. I believe that our youth desperately want meaningful work, and maybe we've not done well at giving them that in the last decade. And there's real problems to be solved. So there is more than enough meaningful work out there. Our job as, I guess, the people in positions of leadership is to build the pathways from where the youth and the younger generation are to those meaningful problems, to create and to support the creation of opportunities for them to work on those meaningful problems, and to reward them, but also not to be strong enough to not reinforce the status quo, to keep putting money in the things we've always put money in, to say to our friends, yeah, it's been a great 30 years, we've had a great ride together, but no, I'm not investing in the next incremental version of you, because I fundamentally disagree that incrementalism is our future and our safety. I think incrementalism encourages concentration, and to return to my original point, actually diversity, portfolio theory. We need to remember we need portfolios, always. And if we go incremental and concentration, we're moving away from resilience, and we're making for very narrow pathways for the next generations to have access to meaningful work. So the leadership you refer to, Perry, I think it's our responsibility as leaders to create those pathways to meaningful work across a portfolio of the very important and pressing challenges that we have. And I have complete faith in our young people that they have the talent and the application to solve them if we get the barriers out of the way.
Well, we certainly have been blessed by forces that are driving change and calling for leadership. So your perspective is very, very timely. Trevor, you want to share with us some parting comments?
Sure. I mean, I'm ridiculously optimistic about Alberta's future. I think we have all the right ingredients in terms of depth of talent, capacity for innovation, industry leadership. We've a demonstrated track record of success on the global stage. So I think Alberta has all the right components, and I remain incredibly optimistic about this place we call home. And it's a great place to live. We have incredible landscapes. We have an amazing environment. The caution and the concern that I have, and it's why I work the way I do and I'm passionate about it, is we are slipping behind. So in a global context, labor productivity in Canada is well behind our industrial peers. R&D spending per capita is ridiculously behind our global peers. We're at the bottom of the OECD. So there is no time to wait. There is no time to rest on our laurels. We have enormous potential and capacity, but we must realize that we must act, and we've got to do it now. Otherwise, we risk getting further and further behind. But I know we can do it, and this group of intelligent people is a prime example of how we're going to get there. So I'll leave it
with your optimism, Trevor, we've got two options. We all move to Sterling, or we review up to Edmonton.
Well, I've got lots I can sell you. Just send me a note, everybody.
Okay.
We'll work out a deal.
Thank you. Deanne, any further comments?
Well, I just keep feeling like saying ditto to what Trevor said, because I'm also very optimistic, especially about rural Alberta. And I think with investing in capacity building and making sure that we're supporting all the legs of the three-legged stool, economic, social, and environmental, we're going to be winners, and we can always do better, even though we're doing a good job right now. And thanks for having me today. I appreciate being here.
Thank you, Deanne. Brad, I'll give you the last word. As you know, I'm very concerned about ESG, which is why I wanted to bring it to the table today as either a force that simply we need to take into consideration, or it's going to impede progress. So give us your viewpoint as your closing comments.
Well, I think it's just simply a new lens in which we communicate better, and we do it with more intention in terms of where we put our investments. But, you know, I agree with Trevor. I said I'd do it all the way to the end, except you're going to find out I'm not going to agree with him all the way. I agree with. I'm very bullish on Alberta, more than I've ever been, for lots of different reasons. But I don't have the urgency, and I'll put that in context, which is we're so young compared, China of 2,000 plus years and Europe, and over 150 years of our history, we've moved from the fur trade, an economy based on the fur trade, to an agrarian economy, to an industrial economy, to a service-based economy, and an energy economy, and now we're into more of a technology and an applied technology economy, all within 150 years. Really, if we look back on it, since the Great Depression, really, we're dealing with 100 years of history, and we've been able to do that, and at the same time, if we look at that 100 years, has outperformed every other jurisdiction in North America, no matter if the price of oil was up or down, in terms of what Alberta's done. And that's a function of the resilience of the people, and huge amount of talent, an incredibly entrepreneurial mindset, and some conditions and our natural resources that allow us to be innovative when we combine those things together. I don't think today is at a whole lot different time than anything else in history, except where a number of things are under attack through an ESG lens. But if we actually slow down and don't overreact and stick to the fundamentals and build great talent, create collaborative environments allowing us to go after solutions, and do it in a collective and an inclusive manner as opposed to that polarized approach, I think we're just going to get there. And I don't mean to be slow for slow's sake, except we can overreact, and I think we're actually on a really good path.
Well, that's pretty